Is not only going to continue, but at this point it's going to accelerate rapidly. One of the things that's helped a lot recently is the fact that it's the world's reserve currency. There are about 10 trillion US dollars outside of the US. This is a big problem because the major export of the United States for the last 30 years has been dollars. The nice Japanese send us Sonys and Toyotas, and the nice Germans send us Mercedes, and we basically just print up dollars and send it to them. That's how $10 trillion got outside of the US. It used to be that just after World War II, all of the skyscrapers in the world, 80% of the aircraft production in the world, 80% of the automobile production in the world, 75% of the steel production in the world, 75% of the stock market value in the world, it was all in America. America was the end-all, the be-all. It was the king of the hill. Now, none of these things are true anymore. And unfortunately, the dollar rests on nothing more than confidence because it's an IOU nothing on the part of a bankrupt government. And the US government, make no mistake, is bankrupt. Its liabilities far, far exceed its assets. So, when the confidence blows away, the first people to dump the dollar are going to be foreigners. And all those dollars, the 10 trillion abroad, are going to come back into the United States. I mean, inflation could explode in this country. It's a very, very unstable situation from many points of view.
So, Doug, a number of countries are already abandoning the dollar. I've read about a trade agreement. 25 countries recently struck deals to trade outside the dollar. China and Russia reached a $400 billion energy deal to trade outside the dollar. This is a trend that's in place right now, and you expect that to...
It's a trend that's accelerating, actually, because at this point, when the Russians trade with the Chinese, which they do, what do they use? They use US dollars, but the US government is an enemy of both. They can see the illogic of trading with each other and having it clear through New York. At the same time, the Iranians trade with the Indians. A lot of big traders around the world that are using the dollar because it's kind of the world's currency. But that's going to end because none of them trust the dollar anymore.
So, Doug, what do you actually see happening with the dollar?
My thought is this, that understanding that the dollar is as unstable as it is, at this point, the Fed might try to create an alternative, and an alternative that's more under their control than the dollar and actually out of the traditional banking system. What would happen if the Federal Reserve created a look-alike dollar? Let's call it the Fed coin, perhaps based on the same technology that Bitcoin is based on. This is the blockchain technology where every transaction can be tracked from the creation of the Bitcoin itself. I suspect the next stage on the part of the government, since they've tried quantitative easing, can't do that too much more after creating trillions and trillions of these paper dollars, which are going to come out of the financial system and into the retail system, exploding prices. Zero interest rates, negative interest rates, huge distortions. That's going to come to an end. What are they going to do next as we enter the trailing edge of the hurricane and everybody will say, do something, do something. Well, what can they do? They've used their two major tools so far. My guess is they're going to come up with a completely digital currency called the Fed coin, which will actually act as a parallel alternative to the dollar. It'll have a lot of advantages from the government's point of view. And as much as people seem to like Bitcoin, the public may accept it to start with.
So, Doug, tell me about this Fed coin. What's it going to look like? Is it going to replace the dollar?
Well, this is a conjecture on my part. It's not going to be physical to start with. It's not going to be paper in any way. It's going to be something that you're going to have on your smartphone. In Canada, they have something called Project Jasper, which is their own version of this. The Chinese have announced that they're planning on a blockchain type currency. The same thing. They've said that they want to see this happen as soon as possible. The British have made an announcement along these lines. This is the latest version of the $100 bill that I've got here.
Right.
But do you remember not so long ago it used to be a little round circle? I mean,
Yeah.
they keep changing the $100 bill. I think in the last 10 years, we've probably had 3 or 4 different $100 bills. Maybe this is getting the public used to the fact that these things can change a lot and quickly. The day is going to come when this isn't worth the paper it's printed on. Currencies, paper currencies, fiat currencies, have a half-life. They're like radioactive elements.
As this cashless society sort of evolves from here, do you see a potential run on the banks?
Sure.
I mean, people have to be afraid of not being able to have cash. I mean, for some of the reasons you've mentioned.
Exactly. And especially as the $100 bill is taken out of circulation, which is the next thing that's going to happen, try this. Go down to your local neighborhood bank and ask the teller to give you $5,000 in cash. First of all, she's going to fill out a suspicious activities report on you, but I doubt if she'll even have $5,000 of cash in the bank. Banks aren't dealing in cash. They're dealing in checks and debits and credits on computer.
Doug, I've heard that the Fed has admitted if there were to be a run on the bank, they don't have enough cash to meet that.
No, of course not, because how can they print up hundreds of billions of dollars overnight so that when people go to their bank to cash their checks, they can be rewarded with $50 and $100 bills? It's not even technically feasible to do that. So somebody takes a check from his employer, puts it in the bank, can't get cash back. What's the bank going to do? Give him another check that he can't do anything with?
So, Doug, I read somewhere that if all the cash that was needed to meet the obligations, the digital obligations that are in the bank, if you had to print that amount of cash, it would take 20 years to print enough bills to satisfy demand. Is that
Those are
right?
the numbers that I understand, because printing up hundreds, forget about printing up 5s and 10s and 20s, it takes a long time. I mean, it's a complicated process. So if there was a run on the banks and people wanted cash, it would be physically impossible to give them enough cash. It would take years, it would take decades for the government to print up enough dollar bills, 20s or 50s or whatever, to give people what they want.
Well, Doug, it sounds like the ordinary American is getting trapped.
Oh, of course he's being trapped. I mean, historically, he could no longer use gold after 1933. Silver was out of the coinage in 1966. The dollar was completely unbacked by anything since 1971. Recent years, with things like FATCA and so forth, it's now almost impossible, as a practical matter, for an American to open up a bank or brokerage account outside the U.S. Look, the thing to remember is that cash is on its way out, not just in the United States, but all over the world. In Sweden, it's almost a cashless economy. In France, in Italy, in Spain, it's illegal to transact for more than 1,000 or 2,000 euros of cash. The euro, the 500 euro note, is being phased out. The reason for this is that if the banks are untrustworthy and interest rates are 0 or negative, why leave your money in a bank? It costs you less to put it under your mattress, actually. So, but they don't want people to have cash. Why? Because they say a cash economy facilitates tax evasion. It facilitates underground transactions. It facilitates drug transactions. It facilitates terrorism, where $100 bills are passed around in suitcases and so forth. So they'd like to kill all currency. Now what are you going to do? You can't leave money in the bank because you're getting 0 or negative interest rates. The bank itself, where you're leaving your money, is unstable, illiquid, probably even insolvent. You can't have cash because the most that they're going to have in the future are 10s and 20s. So what are you going to do? I mean, you're really trapped at this point.
So, Doug, what's the advantage of the Fed coin, if you will, from the Fed's point of view?
Oh, it's a huge advantage for them because in the 2008 crisis, they like to blame a lot of the problems on a lack of transparency. But with blockchain and the Fed coin technology, they can see everything everywhere. So it's complete transparency where they can see everything everywhere that everybody's doing. It's a parallel system relative to the one we have right now, where if anything goes wrong with the US banking system, the US insurance system, you've got the Fed coin as a backup. Fed coin gives them an extremely powerful button to control society and control its individual members. So a lot of advantages from their point of view, and no more bank runs. How can you have a bank run when there is no cash? I mean, it's diabolical in its simplicity.
Well, Doug, it sounds like a real benefit.
I'd say that it's very dangerous. Without cash, you have no privacy. If you have to put everything through a bank account, the government knows exactly what you're buying, what you're selling, how much you're earning. They're in complete control, able to take what they want out of it, including your entire account if you become politically undesirable. There's no reason to trust a digital, computerized economy. As the National Bank of Bangladesh found out not very long ago, they had $81 million deposited with the New York Fed. The New York Fed was hacked, and the National Bank of Bangladesh lost $81 million. Have they gotten it back? No. Will they get it back? No. This can happen to anybody in any bank. This is another advantage of having cash. Sure, it can be stolen, it can be lost, but the size of the thefts that can be conducted electronically in today's world absolutely dwarf any problems that you'd have with cash.
Doug, David Walker, the former comptroller of the U.S. currency, said that taxes in America would have to double or America would go bankrupt. I've heard that this cash economy, this barter economy, takes $400 to $500 billion out of the hands of the government every year.
Oh, and I'd consider that a good thing because people are using that money productively, whereas if the government took its cut out of everything, that'd be that much less that could be used by people to get goods and services that they want and need. This is another reason why the government is going to look to put blockchain in there, because it'll be impossible to escape the tax dragnet with no cash to trade. It'll be barter or use Fed coin. And actually, is that a good thing for the economy? No, it's a bad thing for the economy because people that are dealing in what's called the underground economy are actually providing useful goods and services that if the government extracts its 30 or 40% in taxes, which they'll be able to do now with FedCoin, is going to hurt the economy, not help it. It'll help the U.S. government, but that's different from the economy in America.
Dr. Ron Paul, the former presidential candidate and 22-year congressman, is a friend of yours, Doug, and he said that the cashless society is the IRS's dream. Total knowledge of and control over the finances of every single American. Agree?
Well, I completely agree. And Ron Paul is one of the few decent people that have actually circulated in Washington in recent decades. He's completely right. This is an extremely dangerous development for the average American.
So how is the FedCoin different than the digital money we already own in bank accounts?
Well, right now, those dollars are a liability of the bank. The FedCoin's different because it's not a liability of a commercial bank. It's a direct liability of the Federal Reserve, number one. Number two, it's going to use blockchain technology, which makes it totally trackable, unlike dollars today. So those are two huge differences. It's going to be sold as a safety thing because blockchain is much harder to hack than conventional digital technology. So this is another reason why they're going to want to go in this direction. It's for your own safety.
Well, that's a pretty scary thought. With a Fed coin, you're talking about no privacy at all.
Zero.
That's scary.
Well, not only that, but as an innovation, it's much more convenient for them to create them, to debit them, and credit them. They're really going to be in control of everything at that point. At least now, your dollars are good outside the U.S., they're deposited in banks, you can get cash for them. If they take this to the next step during the next crisis, it's really complete control.
So the privacy out the window with FedCoin. I read that they have a way of controlling how digital currencies, where they can be spent or what they can be spent on. Is that an element of control that the feds could possibly put into this new currency?
Of course. The computer can do anything. When you take your FedCoin via your smartphone, or, and this is rather shocking, but the next step, instead of a smartphone, is everybody has a chip. And a lot of people don't like it. Hey, I've got a chip. I can't lose my wallet. I mean, it's all right here. I mean, your bank account, your medical records, all these things. People are chipping their dogs and their other pets today. Why not chip yourself and carry all your information and your digital money right with you? It's very convenient. It's very stupid from a personal freedom point of view. But at that point, it can be used under this scanner, can't be used under this one. It's all computerized. It's nothing. It's not a cosmic breakthrough at this point.
Well, Doug, it's not as far-fetched, I guess, as some people might believe. I think they have something going on in Japan right now for tourists and fingerprinting, fingerprints and stuff.
You're right, Bob.
Like that.
Actually, reality is outrunning science fiction at this point. As of next year, tourists to Japan, when they enter the country, have to be fingerprinted, and their financial data for their credit cards and so forth correlated, so that this is actually happening in Japan, so that if you're a tourist in the country, you'll also have to use your thumbprint or fingerprint when you use your credit card. So no, the next step clearly is something along these lines.
So Doug, this blockchain technology you've said is going to give the government incredible control. Can you give me an example of what you're talking about?
It's like an anti-cash. If I've got a $100 bill in my wallet or a bunch of 10s and 20s, I can spend them on anything I want, with anybody I want, and nobody knows. With blockchain, I can only spend that money to somebody else who's got a receptive smartphone or chip, and they know exactly who's getting the money and what it's being spent for. And it can be programmed so that certain transactions can't take place, or transactions with certain people or stores or whatever. So you're pretty well blocked in. I mean, for all I know, they might decide that under your Obamacare or whatever comes about after it, you're too fat. You can't buy sugar. But if you can't buy sugar, who can buy sugar? I mean, how are you going to pay the other person to buy sugar if you want sugar? You want ammunition for your gun? Well, maybe you can't buy it. How are you going to get it? How are you going to pay for it? This is a real personal freedom problem. And it's going to be sold to the American people under the guise of convenience and safety and fighting drugs and fighting theft and fighting crime and fighting terrorism and all the usual nonsense. But it's going to be devastating to freedom and economic progress in this country.
I can see how it might be sold, for example, if you limited, say, a 16-year-old's FedCoin account from buying alcohol. I mean, that could be sold as a real benefit. We can enforce the liquor laws.
Well, sure, you can disguise a lot of things as benefits. But how is a 16-year-old going to get something that he or she wants if they can't buy it maybe they'll have to barter. I don't know. Maybe instead of buying something, maybe they'll sell their body in order to get something, because you'll have to barter to get around using Fed coins. So there's all kinds of unintended consequences.
Well, I know with the food stamp program already, there are certain prohibited transactions. You're not allowed to buy liquor with food stamps. You're not allowed to, say, spend your electronic debit cards in strip clubs. I know that's a law in some states as well. So this just seems like a further extension of government control on individual behavior.
Absolutely. They'll be able to prohibit anything without even passing a law, quite frankly. If your FedCoin smartphone or chip isn't programmed to let you buy that, how are you going to get it? You don't have cash anymore.
Yeah, so who needs a gun registry, right?
Well, exactly. So no point in dealing with all these pesky Second Amendment laws at that point. You do an arabesque around it.
This is sounding very Orwellian, and I just wonder how, when the Fed launches this thing, how are they gonna sell this to the public? I mean, what's the pitch on this?
They'll sell it as convenience.
Okay.
It's easy. They'll sell it as security. You can't lose your wallet. Safety. They'll sell it as patriotism, helping the government get the economy back under control. And the average person basically does what he's told. I mean, as I said earlier, even using the language that the government chooses, instead of inflation, it's quantitative easing. No problem. I mean, people, the average guy, sad to say, has so little grip of basic economic theory. And I'm afraid that that's true all the way up to the people in the in the very top echelon of the Federal Reserve, that they can really get away with anything at this point. You know, back in 1968, a guy named McGovern ran for president of the U.S., and he came up with a cockeyed idea. And his idea was, we ought to deposit $1,000 in everybody's bank account to stimulate the economy. Well, it was a laughingstock thing back then. But now, a lot of well-known legitimate economists are saying we ought to have a guaranteed income for everybody in the country. And something like a new currency, a Fed coin, issued directly by the Fed, where you don't have to trust a bank which may be bankrupt, I think that's on the way, actually. Something that could supplement Social Security. Well, not everybody has a bank account with a commercial bank today,
right?
But everybody's got a Social Security number, and they could all have an account directly with the Federal Reserve, which people think, hey, that can't go bankrupt. They actually make our money. It'd be quite easy to reach out to everybody on their smartphone and give them a FedCoin account with the Federal Reserve and distribute the helicopter money in a fair way.
So, Doug, it sounds kind of like Social Security 2.0.
Well, that's very much the case. It's following up a massive disaster. Social Security is a Ponzi scheme, and why not follow it up with an even bigger one? Social Security itself is bankrupt. I don't know where they're going to get the dollars to pay that off. So perhaps they can do an arabesque around the problem by issuing a FedCoin account to everybody to substitute and keep down the number of dollars by having an alternative parallel currency where these obligations can be made good directly with accounts with the Federal Reserve, the issuer of the currency, ruling out bankrupt insurance companies, bankrupt commercial banks, for that matter, a bankrupt Social Security system. So what are they going to do? At this point, they've shot all the arrows in their quiver. They've printed up huge amounts of money. They have reduced interest rates to zero. In fact, at this point, there's about $13 trillion of government bonds around the world that have negative interest rates, where, forget about the inflation losing value, eating the value of your money, you have less money at the end of It's absolutely insane. It's bizarro world where things are turned upside down. It's like the last arrow in their quiver that I can see at this point.
Doug, this is an interesting theory, but is there any evidence that the Fed is actually looking into this at this point?
There actually is. There have been a number of statements by everybody from Janet Yellen on down that this blockchain technology, which is in back of Bitcoin, they consider it viable, they want to use it. And this is unusual in a way on the part of the government. Usually when a new technology of any type comes out, whether it's the horse or the gunpowder or the printing press, the government doesn't like these things, these innovations, because they take power away from whoever controls it, the establishment.
The status quo, right.
Exactly, changes the status quo and gives power to the common man. All these things have liberated the common man. The computer revolution, the internet, is a perfect example of this. But in this case, the situation is so serious, I think the government wants to co-opt this technology, to get in front of this technology. And since it's already been legitimized, the idea of Bitcoin and blockchain technology, I think the next step is that you're going to find the Federal Reserve itself offering FedCoin, which is very convenient for them because with that, they can designate exactly how those Fed coins can be spent. They know exactly who gets them, what they're used for, and so forth. And if there's ever a serious problem with the dollar, for instance, with the trillions of dollars outside the U.S. flooding back into the U.S., it can act as an alternative currency, which, at least for a while, will have some semblance of confidence.
Doug, we'll talk about how you can protect yourself in a moment, but first, I want to get a sense from you for when this is going to be happening. Surely we're talking multiple years, maybe even decades before this comes about.
I think not, Bob. I think that since we're going into the trailing edge of this gigantic financial hurricane now, so we're not talking about decades or years, we're talking months, or for that matter, depending on when somebody views this, it could be a matter of weeks. I mean, there's a certain amount of urgency, not just importance, but urgency in doing this. You don't see this widely reported in the media, but it's happening all around us at this point. Look, in June of 2016, Janet Yellen and dozens of other central bankers met with the top experts in the blockchain area, including the people that are in back of Bitcoin. It's happening now.
The technology is there. But my question to you is, wouldn't it take a long time for an infrastructure to be put in place to allow the FedCoin to, to be distributed?
Actually, the infrastructure is there right now.
It's there right now?
In other words, if the U.S. government needed currency to redeem people's demands for their money at a bank, they couldn't possibly print up enough currency quickly enough. That's out of the question. However, today almost everybody, except the very bottom of society, everybody has a smartphone. And the blockchain technology has been active and used now for a decade.
Now, Doug, just so I understand what's going on here, so the Fed has run out of policy tools. They've printed trillions of dollars, interest rates are basically at zero, and soon they may have to go negative in an effort to stimulate the economy, but they won't be able to do so without banning cash. And then they're going to come up with a new currency, a Fed coin that traps people's savings. Essentially, this could be the ultimate confiscation and control tool. Do I have that right?
Bob, you're absolutely right. The most important thing to remember is that the paper dollar, the $100 bill, the $50 bill, currency itself is on its way out. It's going to be replaced strictly with digital money, as is happening in other places in the world right now. This has got very serious consequences for you on all levels. So plan your life around that.
Doug, I've tracked your career closely since you wrote your best-selling book, Crisis Investing, back in 1979. I know you're not one of those gurus who make huge predictions just to get in the spotlight. When you make a prediction, more often than not, history has proven you right. For example, in your book, you warned corporations would go belly up on a massive scale, but that the government would bail out those which are most inefficient. Sure enough, the S&L crisis ensued with over 1,000 bankruptcies, followed by the Bush bailout in 1989.
Well, a good economist, among other things, anticipates not only the immediate and direct consequences of government actions, but the indirect and delayed consequences as well. Unfortunately, most of the economic pundits you read about are actually just political apologists.
You've issued at least one major prediction in each of the last 4 decades. Let's take a quick look. 9 months before the fall of the Berlin Wall, you wrote, "The Soviets are likely to see their country break up." November 1999, 4 months before the NASDAQ lost over 60%, you said, "Almost every one of the internet stocks is a burning match." You said we'd see, quote, "a 95% plus meltdown among the survivors, with many disappearing totally." Lastly, in 2005, 2 years before the housing crash, you issued this public statement. You said, "What's going on now in the residential real estate market is much like the tech bubble, but potentially much more serious than what went on in stocks a few years ago. The bubble is floating on a sea of debt. When it bursts, millions of houses will hit the market in distress sales." Now, Doug, I'm not going to list all the predictions you've ever made, but these showcase why financial author Robert Ringer has called you one of the great prophets of our time, and why Simon & Schuster has stated you've never been wrong on one of your major predictions. Phil Donahue even once devoted a full hour-long show to your work.
Well, Bob, I don't have a crystal ball. I'm not a fortune teller, but I believe that in the real world, cause has effect and actions have consequences. So the key is to position yourself.
Let's move on to what people can do to protect themselves. The research firm you founded, Casey Research, just put out this new book that outlines your 4-step plan to surviving a currency crisis. It's called Surviving FedCoin: How to Protect Yourself and Profit from the Coming Currency Change. You're making this book available for free to everyone at home. Let's go over the plan.
Well, there's a 4-part program that I put together. First of all, you've got to look at where you are in the world today. What do you own? Where do you live? If you have 2 cars, 3 cars, a bunch of flat screen TVs, too much junk around the first thing is liquidate. I think that you should take everything that you don't really actively need or want and get rid of it. Get fighting fit, get slim, turn it into cash. It'll liberate you psychologically, it'll liberate you financially. It's also true of stocks that might be in your portfolio that your broker put there and you forgot why you owned them. And certainly bonds, which are in a bubble, worst thing you could own right now. So liquidate is the first thing.
So Doug, I understand in the book there are 4 sectors in the stock market that you specifically think investors should be avoiding as we move forward.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's some things that you should avoid like poison. On the other hand, you can take advantage of them as a speculator by going short these things. They crash, you win.
Okay, that's step 1.
Step
2?
Step 1, you're going to want to create. What do you know? What people do you have contacts with? What knowledge can you sell to others? You've got to create. It's not enough just to have the assets that you have. You've got to look at the job that you're in. You've got to look at your entire life situation. And that's what I call the create stage. Then number 3, perhaps from our point of view now, the most important parts of that are the consolidate and speculate part of this. And by consolidate, I mean look at where you should be. your financial assets, stocks, bonds, your IRA, your HR-10 plan, your bank accounts, and so forth. Get them in the right places, in the right kind of assets. Take control of this, because most people just float along one day to the next, and then all of a sudden 2008 happens again, except this time different and worse, and they're in the wrong position. So after you've liquidated, you've got cash, you've got less liabilities, less obligations, now you're going to consolidate and get things together, get organized to get off on a new foot. So consolidation means taking that cash that you got in the liquidation stage, and I'd do two things with it. I'd keep a lot of it in cash, and I would buy gold and silver, coins in your own possession, physically, that you own.
So Doug, expand a little bit on your thinking about why cash is so important right now.
I mean, if you don't want to be completely transparent, to use a currently fashionable word, to these people that want to control your life, cash allows you to remain anonymous. The ability to transact in cash gives you privacy. And privacy is one of the big differences between a civilized society and a primitive society. In a primitive society, in your little dirt hut village, you have no privacy. Everybody can look through your window or pull back the flap on your tent. You have no privacy. Everybody can hear everything, see anything. This is one of the marvelous things about modern civilization, is that you have privacy. Look, one reason for buying things with cash now is that it may not be possible to buy those things with cash later. I'm not sure what percentage of the population owns a gun, but I think that any free man should be in a position to defend himself. You'd better buy them now, while it's possible to do so for cash.
Right.
So this is a very, very serious thing, not just financially, but from a personal freedom point of view as well.
So, Doug, how much cash do you suggest keeping on hand?
Well, one of the problems in the U.S. at this point is that the average guy can't even lay his hands on $400 overnight if he needs it. You might recall an article in Atlantic Magazine a few months ago. I thought it was interesting because it was a mainstream magazine that said that the average American today, or by that they meant about 40% of the country, would have to borrow money to handle an unexpected $400 expense.
Yeah, I read that. That shocked me as well.
That's pretty close to the edge. So the whole country is very illiquid. When everybody else is illiquid, you want to be liquid. So I think that you ought to keep several $1,000s, and if you're watching this right now, that should be doable.
So Doug, you're suggesting that people hold on to several $1,000s in cash, and but what happens if the $100 bill is banned?
These things are just going to go out of circulation, but they'll still be accepted for a good long time. And you might be better off not having hundreds anymore, but having 20s and 10s. Now it's true, that's going to be a bulky little package, but that's the way things are going.
And Doug, I understand that the book contains or reveals the best place to store cash, which I guess will be a surprise to many readers.
Well, there are clever places and not so clever places to keep actual currency, cash. So we go into those things. Some of them are not very obvious at all. And let me add something about consolidate. I think that at this point, it's important that you build your portfolio of gold and silver coins, physical coins, in your own possession. I think that's very important. Most Americans don't have any gold or silver. I would much rather have, if I'm going to keep anything in my pocket, a gold coin like this one. It's not going to lose value, and relative to this paper, it's going to go up. You're going to want to own a lot of gold and silver coins, as many as you can afford, in your own possession, because they're like the anti-Fed coin. Gold and silver are the only financial assets that are not simultaneously somebody else's liability. and they're not digital. So they can't be controlled and tracked the way Fed coin and digital currencies can be. So that's why they're an essential part of your consolidate position, as well as having some actual paper cash.
So Doug, if we go the Fed coin route, you're suggesting that individual investors get their hands on gold coins and silver coins, but isn't it possible that the U.S. government will confiscate gold the way they did back in 1933?
Well, that is one of the problems that we're dealing with now. It's that the U.S. government can and thinks that they should do anything that they want. So sure, that's possible. But that's all the more reason when you buy your gold to buy it with cash, so that there's no record that you own it.
You reveal in the book one last place where you can buy untraceable gold.
That's right, and you ought to do it now. Beat the last minute rush, do it while it's still possible. I'm not so worried about the government confiscating a few gold coins, or even a lot of gold coins from individual citizens, because Americans that own gold today generally own it through ETFs. And most of the gold that those ETFs own is paper gold traded on the futures exchanges. So if the government really wants to confiscate gold this time, they're going to do it through publicly traded vehicles like ETFs and the futures exchanges. I don't think they're going to go rummaging through people's individual houses looking for a few gold coins. But that's why you want to own gold coins in that form, in your own physical possession, as opposed to some paper product through your broker.
So Doug, I understand that the banks are actually following your advice. They're loading up on physical gold. I understand that HSBC has bought 4 tons, Goldman Sachs has bought 3 tons, so they're loading up on the physical stuff, not on the ETFs.
And it's not only commercial banks like them, the central banks of advancing countries like China and Russia, India, Thailand, these central banks are all buying gold as well. And you might wonder, why are they doing that? It's because gold is the only financial asset that is not simultaneously somebody else's liability. And in a world that is as head over heels in debt as this one is, that's critical.
No counterparty risk.
Exactly. There's no daisy chain to break with derivatives and so forth.
So Doug, this Fed coin seems inevitable to me after our conversation here, but let's just assume that it doesn't happen. Can you still make a case for owning gold?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think Fed coin is going to happen, and that's going to accelerate all these things. But I think that you're going to see gold in this next cycle $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 an ounce. It's going to be a seemingly insane number. There's going to be a panic into gold, and it's going to happen not just from greed as people see it going up relative to the dollar, but it's going to happen from fear as well, and it's going to happen from prudence in addition. So you're going to have 3 emotions acting on this gold bull market at the same time.
Doug, I understand that the book reveals the cheapest way to legally buy gold coins in the United States.
Like almost anything else, there are smart ways and not so smart ways to do things. So we absolutely try to cover the practical aspects of all this in addition to the theoretical possibilities we've been talking about.
So Doug, are you suggesting that people buy gold now, or is this something they can do in a few months? Or
I think it's going to go up several 100% from here. So the time to buy it is now. Don't delay. Don't look for a retrenchment. If a retrenchment occurs, use it to buy more. But no, you want to act now, you want to buy now, because it may become impossible to buy gold in the future. I mean, this recently just happened in Sweden. The largest gold dealer in Sweden, their bank accounts were frozen for no reason other than the Swedish government no longer wants to see gold purchased. And this is likely to happen other places. So we're trapped increasingly like lobsters. The government never controls itself. It only tries to control its subjects. And that's the problem.
So this new environment that we're going into is going to require a dramatic change in the way people invest their money.
And not only that, Bob, but it's going to take a huge change in the way they think. People have been hardwired to think in terms of the stability that used to be, but that stability is gone. So they're going to have to change not just their investments, but their whole mode of thinking. They've been guided down the primrose path by the people that control the Treasury Department and the government and the presidency. I mean, if there was any justice in the world, many of these people would be hung from lampposts by their heels. In a time like this, the markets are going to be going up and down like an elevator with a lunatic at the controls. That's bad news from the point of view of most people, because it's a very unstable, unpredictable situation. So you've got to learn to think like a speculator, and that's number 4, speculate, which is to say capitalize on these politically caused distortions, which we're going to see in the market. Because if the stock market falls 80%, that's a disaster if you own stocks. But if you saw it coming and you get short the stock market or buy puts in the stock market where most people are losing 80%,